Hello everyone, welcome to Programming with C++. And this is week 4. Okay, so in this week we'll be learning statements, types of statements, expressions, types of expressions. Okay, so let's proceed to what expressions are. Let's start with expressions. An expression simply means combination of three things, that's variables, operands, and operator. Let's break this down for you. So let's think of an expressions like math problem. Remember from school when we had problems like 2 plus 3. That's essentially what an expression is in programming. So, so let's talk about variables. When we talk about variables, it stores values or results. And let's talk about the operands. They are actual data that operators work with. Let's say you have 2 plus 3, both 2 and 3 are operands. And let's talk about the operators. So with the operators, they are symbols that performs operations, like the plus sign for addition. So these are what I was talking about. This one is the operator. These are the operands. That's A, the B, they are operands, and the plus sign is the operator. So let's move on to types of expressions. Now let's talk about the different types of expressions you will encounter. These are several categories, and understanding this will help you write better code. So the main types are, we have the integral expressions, floating point expressions, we have the mixed expressions, conditional expressions, we have the relational expressions, we have logical expressions, and pointer expressions. These are the types of expressions. So let's talk about the integral and floating point expressions. So integral expressions use only integer numbers. For example, let's say you have 5 plus 3 or 10 minus 2. Since all the operands are integers, the result will also be an integer. And let's move on to the floating point expressions. Use only decimals, as we said in our previous lesson. So for example, we have the 5.5 plus 3.2 or the 10.0 minus 2.5. Since all operands are floating point numbers, the result will also be a floating point number. So this is straightforward. So let's say integers will give integer results, and the floating point will give a floating result. So let's move on to the mixed expression. So let's talk about mixed expression. So now here is where it gets interesting. Mixed expressions contain both integer and floating point numbers in the same expression. So here are some examples you can rectify. We have 2 plus 3.5. We have 6 over 4 plus 6 divided by 4 plus 3.5. Yeah, these are some practical examples we have here. So let's move on to conditional expression. With conditional expressions, we say expressions where the final value depends on whether a condition is true or false. So think of it's like asking a question. If this condition is true, use this value. Otherwise, use that value. We will see more examples of this when we talk about the conditional operator later in the lecture. So let's move on to the relational expression. So with the relational expressions, it compares two values and gives you a true or false answer. They always produce a Boolean result. Thus, data type that can only be true or false. We've all heard about Boolean. That's the Boolean. So with the relational expressions, it compares values. Yeah. So let's talk about the logical expression. That's also interesting. It's the combination of multiple relational expressions using logical operators like the and, or, and not. They also produce true or false results. So it's like this. It's like the relational expression. They also produce true or false results. So let's say they also compare. So it works hand in hand with the relational expression. So now let's move on to pointer expressions. We've already discussed what pointers are. So I think you have a clear idea about pointers. So let's talk about pointers. So pointer expressions works with memory addresses. Don't worry if this sounds complex. We will cover pointers in details in later weeks. So these are examples of pointers. Yeah. So we have an example of pointers as you can see on the screen. These are examples of pointers. So ending expressions. Here is something crucial. Every expression in C++ must end with a semicolon. The semicolon tells the compiler I'm done with this expression. So without the semicolon, I'm not sure the code will run. It plays a major role when coding. So don't forget, when you're done, you have to terminate it. That's the semicolon. So as you all can see, I worked this myself. So these are some practical examples on my screen. As you can all see, int age equals 12. I terminate. Without this termination, that was the semicolon, it won't run. Int x equals hammer. I terminate. Let's say if I run this code, I'll get a result. So let's move on to comments. Below, we move on to statements. Let's talk about comments. Comments are notes you write in your code that the computer ignores. They are for humans to read and understand what the code does. So that's the use of the comments. We say they are statements. So now let's move on to single line comments. That's simple. So single line comments affect only one line of code. You create them using 2 forward slashes. Yes, That's how comments are created. So as you all can see, this is a practical example here about the single line comment. So we said it uses two slashes, two forward slashes. This is so it will comment my codes are written here. So this is. So let's move on to the multi-line comments. That's interesting. So multi-line comments can span multiple lines. They start with dash, your slash, asterisk, and ends with slash, asterisk, slash. So here are some practical examples. So when you talk about this, with this example, the multi-line comments, it comments the whole thing that you are doing, the whole thing, unlike the single line comment. So with this, if you want to comment everything you've written on your code blocks, the code should be written. This is what you have to do. That's your slash asterisk. That's the multi-line comment, which will ignore by the compiler. That means when you comment your code, it won't run. It will never run. So the compiler won't recognize what you've written. That's the use of the comment. It helps the compiler to ignore the codes you've written. Let's move on to indentations. So when we talk about indentations, it's about making your code neat and readable. It's like organizing your room. It doesn't change how things work, but it makes everything much easier to understand. That's the work of the indentations. It makes your code simple and readable. That's the use of the indentations. Each nested block of code should be indented with a tab or space. This visual structure helps you to see how the code is organized. So that's simple. So these are the invitations. Yeah. It makes your code readable and understandable for the programmer or for people to have a clear thought about it. So as I've code here, you all can see that this is understandable. A equals 5, B equals 10. So if A is greater than B, count A is greater than B. Or see out A is greater than B. Don't worry, this is the see outs are not count. Sorry. Now let's proceed to statement. You might be wondering what a statement means. Now let's move on to statement. A statement is a single instruction that tells the computer to perform an action. Think about statement as complete sentence in your program. So statements are the building blocks of any C++ program. Every time your program does, it's made up of statements. So these are statements. says it's a single instruction that performs an action. So let's move on to types of statements. We have selection statements. So it deals in decision making, like if and a switch. Intuitive, intuitive statement. Statements used to express intuition of tasks. That's for wow, do, wow, and stuff. An expression statement. Statements used to evaluate expressions. And we have declaration statements. Also introduce new variable or constants. We have the jump statement used to manipulate normal execution of codes. As you can see, you have the break, continue, and the go to. So let's move on to the compound statement. That's group of what multiple statements together. They are blocks of code enclosed in curly braces. So that's the compound statement. They are always enclosed in curly braces. So this is a practical example of what I implement. That's int A equals B equals 10, int B equals 20. So that's my STP, standard library and stuff. So always remember that when writing a compound statement, it always enclosed in a curly braces. Without it, when you run your code, you get an error. So let's move on to the selection statement. So the selection statement helps your program make decisions. So it helps your program to make decisions when using your C++. They are like asking questions. If this condition is true, do this, otherwise, do that. That's the work of selection statement. So as all can see, this is a diagram that indicates a selection statement. So it deals with true or false and stuff. It's selective. Yeah, when we talk about selective, you will have a clear idea about that. Now let's move on to if statement. So when we talk about if statement, it's most basic decision making tools. It says if this condition is true, execute this code. That is the work of the if statement for deciding whether an action should be taken. So as all can see, that's the syntax of if statement. So we have practical example